Deep in the shadowed hollows of West Virginia's Appalachian Mountains, there existed valleys so cut off from the modern world that even time itself seemed reluctant to enter them. Here, civilization did not arrive in neat roads or tidy boundaries. It crept slowly, hesitant, fading as it climbed higher into the fog-choked ridges. Beyond those ridges lay places where families lived for generations without seeing a stranger's face, places where the rules of the outside world did not apply. One of those places was known only by a whispered name, the Pit. And within it lived a family whose blood would become legend. Not legend in the fairy tale sense, but in the way horror stories are born. Stories shaped by fear, misunderstanding, and the slow corruption of isolation. This is not folklore. This is the documented history of the Blackburn clan, a lineage so genetically closed that it produced physical traits so extreme they inspired the American werewolf myth itself. The first official record of the Blackburns came in 1887, when a government-commissioned physician and anthropologist named Dr. William Fletcher was sent into the Appalachian backcountry to evaluate the health of remote mountain communities. Fletcher had expected poverty. He had expected malnutrition. He had even expected deformity. What he did not expect was what waited inside the mist-filled valley locals refused to enter. Upon my arrival, Fletcher wrote in his field journal on October 12, 1887. I was met by individuals whose physical features caused me to briefly question whether I was observing a divergent branch of the human species. The people who emerged from the fog did not stand upright like others. Their backs curved forward unnaturally. Their faces were long, narrow, and heavy with bone. Dark hair covered their cheeks, necks, and arms. And when they spoke, their lips drew back to reveal elongated canine teeth that glistened in the pale mountain light. Fletcher would later write that the encounter felt less like meeting villagers and more like being surrounded by something half-remembered from a nightmare. This was the Blackburn family. Their story did not begin in the mountains, but with a crime. In the early 1820s, a Scottish immigrant named Jeremiah Blackburn fled into Appalachia after being implicated in a killing back east. He did not go alone. With him came his two brothers, and the women who would become their wives. Those wives were sisters. From the very beginning, the Blackburn bloodline was tightly wound. They settled deep inside a hidden valley accessible only through a narrow mountain pass. In winter, that pass vanished beneath snow and ice, cutting them off from the world for months at a time. No visitors. No new settlers. No marriages outside the family. And the Blackburns wanted it that way. They did not trust outsiders. They did not invite them. Over time, they did not even speak their dialect. What began as a desperate hiding place became a sealed genetic chamber. By the time Dr. Fletcher reached the valley in 1887, the Blackburn clan had grown to 38 people, all descended from Jeremiah and his brothers. Not cousins married cousins. Not second cousins. First cousins. Uncles and nieces. In some cases, fathers and daughters. Generation after generation. Modern genetics would later explain what Fletcher only observed: when a population is isolated long enough, rare recessive traits stop being rare. They multiply. And inside the Blackburn bloodline, those traits took horrifying form. The most obvious was congenital hypertrichosis, a condition causing excessive hair growth over the body and face. But that was only the beginning. Their jaws had changed shape. Their skulls had elongated. Their teeth had grown larger, sharper, more pronounced. Dr. Fletcher sketched one man in particular, Jacob Blackburn, age 42. The subject displays hair coverage across nearly the entire surface of visible skin, Fletcher wrote. Canine dentition extends well beyond normal human proportion, giving the mouth an unmistakably animalistic profile. Jacob was not violent. He was not feral. He was simply different. But difference becomes danger when fear is added. By the late 1800s, stories had already begun to leak from the mountains. Travelers spoke of wolf-faced men. Hunters whispered about creatures walking upright in the fog. They called them the wolf family. And as the myth spread, so did the dread. What no one outside the valley understood was that these were not monsters. They were a family that had never been allowed to be anything else. Modern geneticists would later explain what the Blackburns embodied. When close relatives reproduce repeatedly, rare traits become unavoidable. Abnormal bone growth, excessive hair, dental deformities, all traits that might appear once in 1,000 people, become the rule instead of the exception. Inside a closed bloodline, nature amplifies itself. And by 1887, the Blackburns had become a living archive of that amplification. But the true tragedy was not what they looked like. It was what those looks caused. They could not trade. They could not seek help. They could not leave their valley without being hunted. And then, in the winter of 1888, everything collapsed. Snow began falling early that year. Heavy. Relentless. By December, the mountain pass that connected the Blackburns to the outside world was completely sealed. No supplies. No medicine. No escape. Their small farms failed under frost. Game animals disappeared. And starvation crept into every cabin. The Blackburns had survived isolation for decades. But they had never faced a winter like this. And what happened next would turn fear into bloodshed. By January of 1889, the valley had become a frozen grave. Snow buried the narrow mountain pass beneath drifts higher than a man's shoulders. The Blackburn settlement, already surviving on thin margins, was now sealed inside a white prison. Smoke from their chimneys rose weakly into the grey sky, the last visible sign that anyone still lived in the pit. Inside the cabins, food was running out. Dried meat was gone. Root vegetables had frozen in the ground. Traps set in the forest returned empty. Even the hardiest mountain animals had fled deeper into the wilderness. Those who lived in towns could at least trade. The Blackburns could not. And hunger changes people. In desperation, small hunting parties began pushing farther from the valley, risking exposure to the outside world. One of those parties included Jacob Blackburn and his 17-year-old son, Elijah. They followed deer tracks through waist-deep snow toward the valley's edge. What they found instead was a group of men. 5 hunters from the town of Millerton, armed with rifles and half-drunk on fear, had been stalking game in the same hills. When they saw movement in the trees, they raised their weapons. Then the Blackburns stepped into view. Hair matted with ice. Faces hidden beneath thick growth. Mouths framed by long, protruding teeth. To men raised on stories of mountain beasts, it looked exactly like the legends had warned. One of the hunters, Thomas Ridley, would later confess what happened next. "I thought we'd walked into hell," he said. That man came toward us speaking in that strange broken way they had. In the snow and fog, with his face covered in hair and those teeth. I didn't see a human. I saw something pretending to be one. Jacob tried to speak. He was asking for food. The rifles fired. The first shot dropped him instantly. Blood stained the snow black. Elijah screamed and ran, bullets tearing through the trees behind him as he vanished into the forest. Jacob Blackburn never made it back to the valley. But Elijah did. Bleeding. Shaking. Carrying the news that would doom his people. By the time winter loosened its grip, the story had already spread through the mountains. A wolfman had been killed. A creature had attacked hunters. And others were still out there. Fear does not need truth to grow. It only needs a spark. By February, the rumors had become something else. They said the wolf people were stealing livestock. They said children had vanished. They said the beasts were multiplying. None of it was real. But in isolated mountain towns already starving and desperate, the idea of a hidden enemy became irresistible. And so the hunts began. Groups of armed men formed in Millerton, Pike Hollow, and Red Creek. They spoke openly about cleansing the mountains. They were not looking for help. They were looking for a target. On February 17, 1889, nearly 30 men marched into the valley known as the Pit. What they found was not a den of monsters. It was a dying family. Children with hollow eyes. Adults reduced to skin and bone. fresh graves hacked into frozen earth. Only 24 Blackburns were still alive. But fear is louder than pity. The men surrounded the settlement, rifles raised, faces hard with resolve. They delivered an ultimatum. Leave the valley in 3 days, or be driven out by force. The Blackburns had nowhere to go. This valley was the only home they had ever known. But they understood something the hunters did not. Staying meant death. So they packed what little they could carry and scattered into the mountains, splitting into smaller groups, disappearing into ridges and ravines too remote for anyone else to survive in. The Blackburn clan was shattered. Elijah, now fatherless and marked by violence, led the largest group northward into a jagged limestone ridge known locally as Devil's Backbone. It was a place of caves and sinkholes where even experienced trappers avoided going. If the world wanted monsters, they would become ghosts instead. Historians would later call this moment a genetic bottleneck, when a population is suddenly reduced, and whatever traits remain become even more concentrated in future generations. In the Blackburns' case, it meant something cruel. The very persecution they suffered for their appearance would make that appearance even more extreme in their descendants. They were being hunted for what they were, and forced into conditions that would make them even more so. A cycle of fear and blood had been sealed, and it would not break for decades. By the time the 20th century arrived, the Blackburn name had almost vanished from official records. The mountains had swallowed them. Their old valley lay empty. Their cabins had collapsed into moss and rot. And their story lived only in whispers told around wood stoves and campfires. But legends have a way of attracting the curious. In the spring of 1907, a young physician named Dr. Howard Grant arrived in McDowell County, West Virginia, tasked with building a rural medical practice for one of the most isolated regions in the state. Grant had trained at Johns Hopkins, where the emerging science of genetics was beginning to reveal how inheritance shaped the human body. To him, disease was not just something to treat, it was something to understand. Almost immediately, the locals began warning him. They told him not to go into the high hollows. They told him not to follow strange tracks. And they told him, in lowered voices, about the wolf people. Grant dismissed it as superstition, until the day one of them walked into his clinic. On July 8, 1907, a trapper named Silas Moore arrived at Grant's office, half carrying a young man whose appearance made every nurse in the room freeze. Hair covered his arms, neck, and face. His jaw protruded unnaturally. His teeth curved forward in long yellowed arcs. The boy was 16 years old. His name was Isaac Blackburn. He had fallen while hunting in the limestone ridges north of town, shattering his leg. The wound had become infected, blackened, and swollen. Left untreated, it would have killed him. Despite everything the clan feared about outsiders, Isaac's father, Elijah Blackburn, had finally made a choice. Let his son die, or risk the world. Dr. Grant immediately recognized something extraordinary. The hair growth, the bone structure, the teeth. These were not signs of disease. They were genetic. This young man represents a living archive of inherited traits, Grant wrote in his journal. Not pathology. A lineage. While he cleaned the wound and stabilized the fracture, Grant spoke gently with Isaac, slowly working through the strange dialect he used, an odd blend of archaic English and mountain-born phrases shaped by generations of isolation. What Isaac revealed stunned him. The Blackburns still existed. They lived hidden inside a vast limestone cave system, spread across 3 interrelated family groups, all descended from Jeremiah and his brothers. And they still married only each other. When Isaac returned home, he carried something no Blackburn had ever brought back before. Hope. In the weeks that followed, Grant sent a message through Silas Moore, an offer to help the rest of the clan, no questions asked, no exposure, no outsiders. In October, a reply arrived. Elijah Blackburn would meet him. But only once. Only alone. And never near their home. They met in an abandoned hunting cabin on October 23, 1907. Grant would later describe Elijah as the most physically altered human being he had ever seen. Nearly his entire body was covered in coarse dark hair. His jaw jutted forward with unnatural force. His eyes, though, were sharp and intelligent. Elijah knew exactly what his family was. And what it meant. He spoke not of genes, but of blood. Blood calling to blood. Blood remembering itself. And he understood something else. That new blood would change everything. From that meeting came an agreement unlike anything in American medical history. Grant would be allowed to treat the Blackburns, record their genealogy, and study their condition. In return, their location would never be revealed. For 7 years, Grant kept that promise. He examined 31 members of the clan, mapped their family tree, photographed their faces, and recorded their stories. What he found confirmed every fear and every miracle. First cousins were the standard. Uncles married nieces. 2 father-daughter pairings were recorded. The genetic concentration was extreme. Yet within the caves, the Blackburns had built something else. A culture. They did not see themselves as cursed. They believed they were chosen. Different blood meant different purpose. They passed down oral traditions that framed their appearance as a sacred mark, proof that they belonged to something older and deeper than the outside world. And for a time, it worked. Until the world found them again. Dr. Grant kept his promise. He never revealed where the Blackburns lived. But secrets have a way of leaking into the world through smaller cracks. During the 1910s and 1920s, portions of Grant's research began appearing in obscure medical journals under false names. The location was hidden. The family was anonymized. But the descriptions were unmistakable. A genetically isolated Appalachian lineage. Extreme hypertrichosis. Unusual cranial and dental development. A closed breeding pool lasting generations. To scientists, it was a breakthrough. To the public, it was something else. By the mid-1920s, America had developed an obsession with the strange. Pulp magazines filled grocery stores. Sensational stories of monsters and mysteries flooded the newsstands. And buried inside those lurid pages was the skeleton of a real family. By 1925, at least 17 different pulp publications were running stories about the wolf people of West Virginia. They were no longer a family. They were a species. Stories described them as feral, predatory, barely human. One magazine went further than all the others. In October 1927, Weird Tales of the Mountains published a cover showing a wolf-faced creature dragging a screaming traveler through the woods. The story beneath it was titled The Beasts of Devil's Backbone. It claimed to be based on true events. It named the Blackburns. And it told readers where to find them. At the same time, Appalachia itself was changing. Coal companies were blasting roads through the mountains. Logging operations carved deep into forests that had stood untouched for centuries. Rail lines snaked into valleys that had never known engines. The Blackburns were no longer protected by distance. In the summer of 1931, that protection finally failed. A geological survey team working for the Eastern Mining Consortium entered a limestone region near Devil's Backbone, mapping potential coal seams. Inside a cave system, they found people. 12 to 15 of them. Hair-covered. Hunched. Defensive. The survey report was dry and technical, but one man ignored protocol. His name was Charles Holloway. He took photographs. Those images, 3 Blackburn men standing at the mouth of their cave, were sold to the Charleston Gazette. On August 3, 1931, they ran on the front page under a single headline. Wolf People of Appalachia, Myth Confirmed. The article described the Blackburns as humans deformed by generations of improper relations. Within weeks, the mountains were crawling with strangers. Reporters. Curiosity seekers. Self-declared monster hunters. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted trophies. At least 27 expeditions entered the region between August and October. One reporter, James Harrison, joined a group and quickly realized what it had become. They carry ropes, he wrote. Chains. They speak of capturing one of them. Of selling it. Harrison fled before it was too late. But the Blackburns had nowhere to run. Elijah, now in his late 50s, made the final decision. They would disappear. Again. In the fall of 1931, the main Blackburn settlement abandoned Devil's Backbone and moved north into the most remote regions of the Monongahela National Forest. Smaller family groups scattered in every direction, some attempting to blend into society, others vanishing into wilderness. By the time the Great Depression took hold, the hunt stopped. The world forgot. But the damage was done. The clan had been fractured beyond repair. By the middle of the 20th century, the Appalachian Mountains were no longer the isolated wilderness they had once been. Electric lines cut through valleys that had never known light. Gravel roads followed creeks that had only ever seen mule tracks. Government survey teams, forest rangers, and construction crews pushed into regions once protected by sheer inaccessibility. For the Blackburns, this meant one thing. There was nowhere left to hide. The final confirmed glimpse of the main Blackburn settlement came not from a hunter or journalist, but from the sky. In 1953, the United States Geological Survey conducted an aerial mapping project over the northeastern section of the Monongahela National Forest. Among thousands of photographs, analysts later noticed something strange, a small clearing hidden in dense forest containing nearly 70 primitive structures clustered around a central open space. It was not a logging camp. It was not recreational. Historians now agree it was the last known Blackburn homestead. After that, the trail goes quiet. No raids. No photographs. No more sightings. But the family did not vanish. They dispersed. Genealogical records from counties surrounding the forest show something remarkable beginning in the mid-1950s. People with the surname Blackburn, born between 1925 and 1935, began appearing in marriage licenses, census records, and employment rolls. They married into established families. They moved into towns. And most importantly, they did not look like monsters. The hair was lighter. The jaws were smaller. The teeth were normalizing. Science explains why. The traits that once defined the Blackburns were recessive. When new genetic material entered the bloodline, those traits were diluted. Within 2 or 3 generations, they all but vanished from the visible body. By the 1960s, the wolf people were gone. But the blood remained. One of the last living witnesses to the Old World was a woman named Mary Williams, a great-granddaughter of Elijah Blackburn. In a 1987 oral history interview, she described what her grandfather told her. There was a time when we had to hide because people couldn't see past what we looked like. He said our family chose to fade so the children could live without fear. Mary herself showed only faint traces of the old lineage. Slight hair growth. Minor dental abnormalities corrected by braces. To anyone else, she was just another Appalachian woman. And that was the point. The Blackburns had survived by becoming invisible. Today, genetic testing suggests that thousands of Americans carry fragments of Blackburn DNA. The genes that once created the wolf people still circulate quietly through West Virginia, Kentucky, and beyond, rarely expressed, but never gone. What remains most powerful is not their biology. It is their story. A family so isolated that nature reshaped them. So feared that society turned them into monsters. And so hunted that they chose to disappear. In the foggy hollows of Appalachia, people still tell stories about creatures with fur and fangs who walk like men. Few realize they are talking about a family. A family whose only crime was being born different. And whose legend will outlive them all.